Hi, I'm Bern from Tucson, Arizona. Seminary Dropout with Shane Blackshear is supported by listeners like you and me. You should support the show like I did. It's easy. Just visit seminarydropout.com and click Become a Patron.
You're listening to Seminary Dropout, and I'm your host, Shane Blackshear. Somewhere in between seminary and youth camp, it's Seminary Dropout. Let's go. Karen Swallow-Prior, thanks so much for joining me on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
Can you remember when you first became conscious of who Hannah More was?
I do remember very well. I was doing research for my doctoral dissertation, and I was researching another writer, a more famous novelist named Samuel Richardson, who wrote the longest novel in the English language. And I really wanted to write my dissertation on him, but I was floundering in my research for literally years and years, as people often do. And I was really frustrated, and I had an appointment with one of my committee members or potential committee members on a Monday, and I was living in Buffalo, going to school at the University of New York at Buffalo. And I spent the day Sunday before my meeting in prayer and fasting because I was supposed to meet with this professor, and I had nothing to say. And we had a blizzard that night. And the very rare event of the university closing in Buffalo, because that never happens, happened. So I stayed home that day and continued my research. And in one old dusty book, I stumbled across the name of Hannah More, who I'd never heard of. And as soon as I read whatever little bit about her was in that book, I knew I wanted to write my dissertation on her, and that's what I did.
Well, you're a writer, English professor. Did you feel like you had found a kindred spirit in Hannah More?
Well, at that point, I didn't know quite enough about her when I first stumbled across her. I saw that her role in the rise of the English novel, which was the area I was studying, was interesting, and I thought was something that hadn't been written a lot about. And so I also learned in that little snippet that she was a Christian, and so I thought, well, she sounds like an interesting person to learn about. And then as I did begin to research and write about her, I did feel like I had found a kindred spirit, and it was really neat.
William Turner.
Bill.
Bill, did you call him Bill? You're on a first name basis with them? So he was engaged to Hannah. They set a wedding date, and 3 times he backed out.
Right.
The last time he literally left her at the altar.
Well, that's one of the stories that ends up getting told. It's not entirely verified. So, so that's one story that gets told, that he left her at the altar. It's an exciting one. But 3 times the date was broken. Yes, the engagement.
I mean, in my life, I've known one couple who called off the wedding and broke up like very, very close to the wedding date. It was the guy's doing. And I remember talking to that friend, and she's saying, just saying what a big embarrassment it was. And like things like, they had already had a wedding shower, and she was saying like, I've got all this stuff and I don't know what to do, like to explain to these people, like, do I give it back to them? Like there's all these kind of social issues around that.
Right.
Do you
think... And the humiliation.
Exactly. The humiliation, the embarrassment. What do you think the collateral damage was to Hannah's life? Either being jilted at the altar or not, just having the three wedding dates.
Right.
And especially in a time where there are just tons of like social mores that are very strict. They seem to have a lot of real life consequences in people's life at that time.
Absolutely. This is, for a woman to be engaged and then not to marry was essentially to make her, and I'm sorry to use this phrase, I don't like the phrase, but it's apt in these cases. It made her damaged goods, essentially. It would be very difficult for her to get engaged again. She did get at least one other offer of marriage, so it wasn't impossible, but it put a woman in a very awkward and difficult social position in life. And so And it was very humiliating for Hannah too. She always suffered from ill health, and when she had a kind of public setback, as she had many of them in her life, it would always send her into some kind of an illness, probably related to what we would call today depression. And she certainly felt the ill effects on her body and mind as a result of this failed courtship. But the other part of it was that it was also customary for gentlemen who did not follow through in their promise to marry a woman to settle with her financially, because she, basically he had ruined, a man would have ruined a woman's ability to be supported or have, economic sustainability. And so Hannah was not part of this. She was too humiliated. She would not have wanted to do this, but her friends and family intervened and accepted on her behalf an annuity of £200 a year. And that actually was enough to give her financial independence. She quit her job as a teacher, and that's how she made her way as a writer. And the course of her life and the course of British history changed as a result.
And it seemed like, too, the idea behind the annuity was he was kind of like paying her back for lost time that she had spent with him and could have been working on her writing career.
Well, or, I think in those days it was more the compensation was for time she could have been spent being courted by someone else. Okay. Right. At this point, she wasn't necessarily thinking of a full-time writing career. And she'd also invested, as women did, she'd invested in a considerable trousseau. She had to buy clothing and other personal effects that she would need to be the wife of a gentleman, because she was really would have been marrying up. And so she'd invested time and money into this this marriage that was supposed to take place, and so she really did need to be compensated, and it was common at the time.
Do you know how long that annuity lasted?
I believe it lasted the rest of her life, and
Wow.
The story goes that William Turner, for the rest of his life, raised a toast to her every evening with his daily glass of wine or whatever. As much as it could be, it was an amicable separation. Nowhere is it recorded why he had such cold feet. I offer a theory in the book, and that theory that I had was confirmed by neighborhood gossip when I traveled over to England last year, because the neighbors still talk about Hannah More and her friends over there.
And he even kind of shows up in her life several years later, and it seems like they kind of become friends after that, and are kind of fond of
The
each other.
story is that he was traveling along the road, and he saw this lovely home with lovely gardens, because Hannah did have quite a green thumb. She really enjoyed gardening, and he stopped to inquire whose lovely garden it was, and lo and behold, it was his old fiancée, Hannah More. And that the story is that he went in and they had a pleasant chat, and remained friends after that.
What was the prevailing attitude at the time towards women who had careers, if you want to call it that, but worked and kind of had their own life, so to speak?
Well, there weren't a lot of those kinds of women. Primarily, a woman could be a teacher, or she could be a wife and mother. And that was really about it. The only women who had any kind of literary career were typically aristocratic women who just sort of dabbled in writing on the side. There were a number of those women who were learned and wrote poetry and verse and so forth. And then the other women, the few women who did have literary careers, or careers in the arts, were usually more scandalous women. Aphra Behn in the late 17th, early 18th century, who was a novelist, dramatist, and so forth. She was also a spy and had a pretty scandalous life. And then More's contemporary, Mary Wollstonecraft, who is considered today the mother of feminism and wrote The Vindication of the Rights of Woman, was a revolutionary. And so she was married to an anarchist, and William Godwin. And so the examples of women who were conservative, evangelical Christians with traditional mores and political positions. There just really weren't a lot of them. There was a young woman close to More's age called Jane Austen that no one ever heard of and wouldn't really hear of until well after Austen's death. But that just shows how few there were, and Hannah More really was a rare woman in that time.
Well, and it seems like even the literary thing is just at that time just becoming, it's on the cusp of becoming an acceptable thing. And like you said, it was kind of an edgy thing and associated with more like promiscuous people at the time.
Exactly. I mean, in the book, I talk about the phrase that's used for women writers, the female pen, which is sort of a phallic joke, but it gives you the idea of how people thought it was actually unnatural for women to write, and those women who were writers either didn't do so as a serious pursuit, like the aristocratic women who had some privilege, or the women who took it seriously and tried to make a living at it were often associated with scandal and promiscuity and so forth. So Hannah More was really a pioneer in the sense that she balanced this sort of edginess of being a woman writer and one of the first women to make as much money as she did writing, and also have this reputation, a reputation rooted in truth of being a conservative, pious, moral woman.
Hannah was tremendously successful over the course of her life, but as you kind of alluded to, she had real self-confidence issues. And a lot of, it seems like throughout the book, it's kind of like this happened and then Hannah got sick, and then this happened and then Hannah got sick again.
Right.
And a lot of that seemed to be based on some of the reactions that people were giving to her work a lot of the times.
Right. I mean, there are so many things, I think, at the root of that lack of confidence in Hannah. One of them, which of course was not even a word or a phrase used that day, is class anxiety. More was born in a time when what we call now the middle class, which wasn't really called that then, was just developing. The idea of social mobility was still new, and Hannah More was one, and her sisters were early examples of socially mobile people, let alone socially mobile women. And so she ended up, rising from these humble origins with a school teacher father. I mean, her father and mother both were actually even, her mother was some kind of a farmhand, and her father was a bailiff. And so that they were really laboring class people. And then he got a position as a school teacher, which was a little bit higher, but not much. It was at a charity school. And so because of her engagement to this wealthy landowner, and then the beginning of her writing career and her introduction to London Literary Society, she began hanging out with the social and literary elite of the day, but yet she was not born into that class. So this need of hers to be accepted, to be praised by the upper class, followed her throughout her life, yet at the same time she justifiably always had this anxiety about not fitting in. Of course, when she really turned to moral and religious reform, her goals changed significantly from being accepted by the literati to being accepted among fellow evangelicals. So that diminished a little bit, but she continued to be sort of a celebrity, really, and I think it just goes along with celebrity status. There really aren't many celebrities. Celebrityhood feeds a sense of anxiety because there's always that need to continue to be accepted and be embraced. And so she shows that in her life throughout all the way to the end, really.
Well, two, it seems like her friends, first of all, seem to be almost a who's who of famous people from that time period. And you get the feeling that that self-consciousness was mostly on her side. I mean, it seems like these people really loved her. Like, they really liked her and who she was and liked spending time with her.
Yeah, most of them did. There are, there was some cattiness. I included one excerpt from a letter where one of the ladies among the Blue Stocking Circle, which was an elite literary circle, rated her on her
that's
her
right.
manners and
Yeah.
her face and so forth. So there was some reason for lack of confidence, but it was really more. I mean, she really was widely accepted. But I just think that anxiety always followed her, and yeah, it was just part of her personality. It was her strength and her weakness. Her desire to have great accomplishments and to be recognized for those motivated her to do these great things and write such works that were so well received and widely read. Yet at the same time, the criticism that came with it really it undid her, and she really did not enjoy criticism. She didn't have as thick a skin as other people might who are thrust into the middle of social and political and economic upheaval.
There's a great little episode of her life that's really fascinating to me where she goes to, in 1763, she goes to these series of lectures on the topic of eloquence. Mm-hmm. You said the topic of eloquence was something that Christians had been conflicted about since the first century church, when Paul wrote that when bringing the gospel, he didn't come with eloquence. Mm-hmm. And so when people in 1763 hear the word eloquence, were they thinking of the same thing that we think of when we think of eloquence? Does that word mean a little bit different now than it does then?
Let me see. I think of it in those. Let's see. I'm not sure what people think of it today. So, I mean, eloquence, as Paul talks about it, and even Augustine talks about, he wrestles with this a lot. Augustine does. He's more conflicted than Paul is on the subject of eloquence. In rhetoric, eloquence has to do with style as opposed to substance. And of course, the 18th century is called the neoclassical period, and it emphasized style. Neoclassical verse is very much focused on the form and structure, and so also was drama. And so eloquence was important in the 18th century. It went out of style later on, but so I think maybe another word that we would use today would be rhetoric. Mm-hmm. I think.
So it's generally speaking, beautifully speaking. Mm-hmm. Well,
yes, and as a rhetorical strategy, yes.
Yeah, and so you could understand, in Paul's writing, he's saying, "Look, I'm a tent maker. I don't speak eloquently."
Right.
So that's fascinating to me for a few reasons. I have a theory that in the same way that, the second commandment of the 10 Commandments says not to make a graven image, that really caused the church for a long time to prohibit painting and that kind of an art like that. And I have a theory that it's left us with the legacy of having a real awkward, bad relationship with art in the church. Yes. And that's why there's so much bad Christian art. Yes. And I'm wondering if in the same way that Paul's words about eloquence may be connected to the reason that Christians seem to make a lot of bad literature today as well. I'm thinking specifically of the Christian romance genre.
Right.
and things like it.
Yeah, I think, the church has such a long and complicated history with, as you already mentioned, art, and eloquence and literary excellence are, of course, a subset of art. We see it in Paul. We see it in Augustine. There's also the additional baggage that classical rhetoric is associated with, with pagan classicism, the pagan Greco-Roman world. And so... and then you have schools of rhetoric where eloquence is much more important than even substance, and so therefore truth doesn't really matter. It's just the style. So there's a lot of baggage that comes along with beauty, whether it's visual beauty or beauty of language, and that more came of age. She was born and came of age in the middle of this century, that was, again, called the neoclassical period, where these things were actually admired and appreciated. And so she carried that kind of aesthetic with her, even when she shifted and became more interested in didactic works and not as interested in eloquence. So she herself has sort of a conflicted view of eloquence and literary excellence, I think. That's what makes a lot of her later works almost unreadable today. They're so didactic. Yet you can still, if you can get past that, you can still see the eloquence there. I mean, she really, really was an eloquent writer.
Well, and that leads perfectly into the next question, because it seems like Hannah, she saw within the greater culture some good writing, what she thought was good writing, and she liked the style and wanted to write in that way, but with content that was more in line with her puritanical beliefs.
Yes, exactly. The two, she wrote a lot of treatises, which are supposed to be sort of dry and didactic. We don't read a lot of those today. I mean, we do, I guess they're just blog post length, but she wrote books of that length. And so within that genre, we just don't read that stuff today. It was very popular then. But the works that are most interesting, where she adapts the style of popular literature for her didactic purposes, are her single novel that she wrote, which again is pretty much unreadable today, but was one of England's first best-selling novels. And so the novel then was actually still a new literary form. It was not respected. It was still associated with romances, tales of illicit love and so forth, and learned writers. The world of polite letters still disdained novels because it was something written in the common language for the lower and middle class. But Moore took this form that was wildly popular, that she herself had even written against young ladies reading novels, and she wrote a novel. She adapted that controversial form for the purpose of basically giving instruction through the story of this young man in search of a wife on the subject of companionate marriage, which was really a very evangelical concern at the time. The idea, and that was a new idea too, the idea that Christians should marry a person who is a good spiritual and personal match for them. We take that, I mean, it's really the idea that we have today, but it was a very new idea then, because people generally got married for, really political or economic expediency. So Moore was really brilliant in adapting that novel form for her purposes. And then the other form that she used, which most critics today agree really is her most significant artistic contribution to letters, is the series of cheap tracts that she wrote for the poor who had just learned to read. There were lots of penny tracts and pamphlets and broadsheets that the poor could buy, and they were usually very cheaply made, as the name suggests, and they would contain bawdy stories or silly songs or horoscopes and predictions and so forth, things that an evangelical Christian like Moore would not want the poor to be reading. So she took that form and not only wrote these great tales and stories and ballads with moral and the religious tales in them, but she actually perfected the form of the tracts too. She hired one of the best illustrators in London to illustrate the covers, so that the covers are actually highly artistic. And she wove in a sort of intertextuality that was unusual for the time by sort of a meta narrative. She put she would, on one track she had that was part 2, she had a picture from of the tract on the cover that was part 1. This was very sophisticated art for cheap tracts at the time, and it was a really successful project that basically provided reading material for the newly hungry to read poor, but also had the purpose of letting them read the things that Moore and her friends thought would develop their morality and increase their frugality and improve their lives, rather than silly songs and horoscopes and bawdy stories.
Hannah had seems like a unique relationship with Samuel Johnson, who was a huge literary figure in his time. What was their relationship like?
Well, on Moore's second trip, I believe it was, to London, because as it was common then, she lived in Bristol, which was a 2-day drive, carriage ride away. And so it was common for folks like Hannah to go and spend the winter in London away from the sea. So her second trip there, she actually had her sort of a dream come true. She got to meet Samuel Johnson. She was taken by a mutual friend into his house, sat in his sitting room waiting for him to come out. And when he entered the room, he entered and quoted her own verses to her. He had memorized one of her early poems, and what flattery that is to meet this person who, Dictionary Johnson, who really was 18th century literature. And so from there, it just got better and better. He was much her senior. He was an old widower. And of course, Moore at this point was pretty much committed to the life of celibacy and singlehood, and much younger. But the two of them just flirted like crazy, went to dinner parties together, laughed. Letters home from her sisters said, "Oh, we expect them to be running away soon." And of course, no one really expected that, but they had a great deal of fun flirting with one another and enjoying dinner parties and having literary exchanges. So that was a fun time for Hannah More.
That goes down as got to be one of the all-time greatest first impressions, walking in a room and saying, reciting her own poem back to her.
Yeah, man, that's about the best you could get in the world of letters, is being quoted by Samuel Johnson.
You mentioned earlier about her being a part of the Blue Stock Circle. That was a group of writers and intellectuals who were mostly women who came together and discussed literature and read together and that kind of stuff. So I guess the way the group worked is people would sponsor other people into the group, and to get into it, you had to have a sponsor. Hannah sponsored Anne Yearsley, who at the time was a poor woman. I think she's working as a milkmaid.
Right.
But Hannah found out that she had written poems, and so kind of tutored her. It seems like kind of became a mentor in the literary sense. But that relationship went pretty sour, it sounds like.
Right. It's important to remember that this was just before the Romantic Age. And so, our ideas about literature and especially poetry are so influenced by Romanticism now that we think it's always been that way. But before Romanticism, the taste in literature was much more classical, much more erudite. And so the idea of that a plain, uneducated milkwoman's rustic poetry would be well read and liked was new. I mean, we sort of take that for granted now. But what Hannah More did is she discovered this raw talent in Anne Yearsley and schooled her and mentored her and had her poetry published. And that's a very romantic approach before Romanticism hit. But More still was traditional and conservative and had sort of a paternalistic approach to this. And so, again, you have to remember that at that time, the poor were considered born poor, and that it's God's will for them to be poor. And the idea of improving the lot of the poor was not in most people's minds at all. And so what More was doing is what she was trying to improve Anne Yearsley's life, but she also did it in a very, sort of protectivist way. And so she took care of her money. She kept it in an account and so forth, and wouldn't give Anne Yearsley control of the money. And that's really why it went badly. Anne Yearsley charged More with keeping her money and not and using it for herself and so forth. And so that's where sort of this tension between this new romantic and revolutionary, these tendencies in society that were coming along were conflicting with the old sort of parochial, paternalistic, and aristocratic approach that just saw poor people as being poor and needing to be kept in their place, and it was the job of the well-to-do to help them, but not to lift them up, if that makes sense. So those sort of forces converged and just ended very badly.
It seemed like it was very risky for Hannah to sponsor her into the Blue Stock Circle in a way, because like you mentioned before, there were at least a few there who were already looking down their nose at Hannah herself.
Well, actually, it's in a way it's the opposite, because what the wealthy women that was becoming a trend for wealthy women to find this raw talent and sponsor it, but it was being done in a way that it was like, oh, look at me, I'm
Right.
helping you, and so this actually put more further into their camp of being, because for almost all of human history, even if they weren't doing it, it was always considered the upper class's responsibility to take care of the poor, not to help them move out of their station, but to care for them. So that impulse was part of that old mindset of the old guard, and so this made Moore feel more like she was one of the members of the aristocracy by helping the poor. So if that makes sense.
Yeah. So it was almost like a status symbol to have a little project.
Yes.
Hannah, a big part of her life and who she was that she was really involved in the abolitionist movement. It seems like part of the genesis of that in her life seems to be like it may have been when she read, I don't know if I'm saying this right, Cartophonia by John Newton.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's correct.
What kind of impact did that have on her life?
Well, again, tracing her spiritual development, we can kind of do only indirectly based on the letters that she wrote in the journals and so forth. And so we don't have, it's not as though we have a lot of contemporary records. So Moore always, even in her, her high-flying London literary days when, before she really had this evangelical shift, she was always considered more pious than her friends. Her friend David Garrick, the famous Shakespearean dramatist, always teased her about being a Sunday woman and always encouraged her not to participate in the Sunday activities that the rest of them participated in. So she always had this pietistic bent. But when Moore read John Newton's anonymously published collection of letters on spiritual matters called Cartophonia, or Utterances of the Heart is how it would be most likely translated, she wrote about this book in a letter to one of her best friends, and what she wrote about it, about how it affected her, and this religion of the heart, as it was called then. It's clear that she was articulating a sort of evangelical experience, perhaps not for the very first time, but the first time at least that is in the written record. So I point to that moment and say, clearly Moore understands what we today would call, a personal relationship with Jesus or a born again experience. Even though I don't think, even though at that time that kind of dramatic before and after language wasn't really the norm. So that is definitely a landmark, I think, in the written record that we have of Moore's spiritual journey.
And it causes her to seek out John Newton, right?
Yeah. She goes goes to his church outside of London one Sunday to hear him preach, and stayed after to talk to him one-on-one for like a couple of hours. And she writes in her journal that she came home with her pockets full of sermons, which I love that image. Yeah, and they became great friends from then on. And that's right around the time that she met William Wilberforce too. And then that whole those figures, along with other people, just coalesced around the movement to abolish the slave trade.
Yeah, and so it seems like what I was alluding to earlier, that Cartophonia seems to be, when she read that, seemed to be kind of the seed that one thing led to another. And so, how did things progress from there? She meets John Newton, and then she meets Wilberforce.
Right. Her opposition to slavery, at least in the written record, dates back even at least 10 years earlier than meeting Newton and Wilberforce. Through her friendship with Charles and Mary Middleton. Charles Middleton was a sea captain, and who was introduced to the slave trade while out on the sea and saw it firsthand. I can't say much about slavery in America. It was a totally different animal that I really can't wrap my mind around. But in England, there weren't a lot of slaves in England, and there weren't plantations and so forth. So England's reliance on the slave trade was one that kept the whole dirty business shielded from the eyes of most citizens. So when someone like Charles Middleton would witness what was happening in the slave trade in Africa and on the ships, and he would come back and tell other people. And so through his testimony and his friend, Moore was introduced to the horrors of the slave trade, and it was really at the home of the Middletons. They are the ones who enlisted Wilberforce and a bunch of other people, and that their home became sort of the headquarters, and that was one of Moore's second homes. And so she ended up being involved with all these late night meetings and strategy gatherings to figure out how to abolish the slave trade in England.
When you read about it, it almost sounds like the stories you hear about Operation Valkyrie in World War II when they're like trying to overthrow Hitler. I mean, it's kind of a almost underground countercultural type of thing. Yes,
exactly. It really was.
And for them, their maybe not their entire economy, but so much of their economy was based on it. England was being made prosperous on the backs of slavery in a lot of ways.
Absolutely, and I mean, if it wasn't their whole economy, it was so much of it that even people who could see that the slave trade was not desirable, which was a lot of people, but they could not even imagine. They could concede that it wasn't desirable, but they could not imagine being without it. It was so deeply ingrained in British society. I mean, even it's an interesting irony that Moore and her sister's school that they opened in Bristol when they were young women was catering to the daughters of the newly emerging middle class, the merchants and tradesmen, all of whom, that money was all coming from this burgeoning slave trade. And so, I mean, every aspect of British life was somehow connected directly or indirectly to the slave trade. And so many people, even if they did acknowledge the horrors of the trade, just could not imagine how they could ever be without it. But these visionaries like Moore and Wilberforce and Newton, that didn't stop them. I mean, they just knew it was so horrible and so evil and so wrong. It needed to end.
And I didn't realize until I read it in the book that Newton himself had been sold into slavery at some point.
Right. That's another reason why I think it's hard for us to look back and see how people could tolerate slavery, but it wasn't as black and white then as we see it now, because it was a cruel and barbaric society across the board in many ways. And so the British government, I mean, actually the whole military was based on a system where it was called impressment, where if you were a man walking along the street and some soldiers came along and decided they needed your services, they could basically kidnap you and impress you into service forcibly, and there was nothing that you could do, and that would be as a British citizen. And so that was a kind of a form of slavery. Not as horrible, but still a form. And then even that same person who was impressed could be forced into service on a slave ship. And Newton himself was, if you'd misbehaved or got on the wrong side of the captain, he could, when you landed in Africa, sell you to a slave trader, and that happened often. And Newton was one who was sold into slavery and spent some time as a slave. And so it was so. The tentacles of the slave trade were so many and so tightly gripping so many aspects of British society that it was really hard to unravel them all to see where one aspect of the slave trade began and another ended, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it seems like, again, when we look at it today, I think we look at it from a point of view of, hey, we're fine and we don't have slavery today, which, is not entirely true, but, as an institution,
right.
As illegal, I guess is what I should say. We're fine. But essentially what they were saying was, let's take, and this isn't precise, but let's take a third of our economy away overnight.
but it was nowhere near as devastating as the worst predictions would have it, because human beings being made in the image of a creative and a generous God, we have boundless ingenuity and boundless ability to bounce back. And so it really wasn't even as bad as what some people said, because there are always other ways for creative and greedy people to find a way to make a living and to create and offer things. And so you look back now and you really, look at England and look at America now, and we're doing fine without this. But then that also begs the question of, well, what else are we involved in? What else that's so deeply embedded in our culture, economically, socially, politically, that we can't, we might say is bad or not desirable, but what else could we do? I know we have those things today that we can't imagine being without, even if we think that they aren't desirable.
So maybe there's a lesson to be learned about the unforeseen positive side effects of recognizing the image of God in people.
Absolutely.
Hannah died, 2 months after slavery was abolished in England?
Yes, just weeks afterwards, in 1833, her very close friend, Wilberforce, they were friends their whole life, died a couple of weeks before the slaves were freed, and Moore died a few weeks afterwards. Very bittersweet, but it took them, it took decades. It was a decades-long battle to abolish the slave trade and then to set the remaining slaves free.
There are pieces of Hannah's legacy all over present-day England today. Is that correct?
Yes. As I mentioned earlier, when I went there last summer to just kind of follow in her footsteps and see where she was born and lived and died, it was really delightful to talk to people there. This is almost almost 3 centuries ago. Is that math right? Yes. I don't know. 2 centuries ago.
Yeah.
Yes. And people still talk about her. The people who live in the home next to one of her homes talked about her and talked about William Turner and the failed marriage, and talked about Wilberforce coming and visiting and putting his horse up at the barn across the street. And there are many schools and nursing homes and streets and schools named after her. So people still remember Hannah More. A few, maybe even not so fondly. I talked to one young man who, he answered the phone, and I told him why I was calling. And for his employer, and he said, "Oh, Hannah More." He said she put an end to a lot of fun in Nelsie, where I grew up. So he was still a little bitter about Hannah More, the killjoy, who came along with her Sunday schools and tried to elevate the poor. So she is remembered in Bristol, where she grew up. But I think she's been forgotten by so many. I hope that my story helps to reintroduce her to the world.
Well, it seems like there's something about Hannah's story that's particularly pertinent for today, for where we are today. Was that part of why you chose to tell Hannah's story when you could have written about anything else?
Yes, that is part of why I wrote about her story. I think there are a lot of things about her world that are applicable to our world today. There are things that we think are just, there's no way we could ever change in our world. There are divisions in our world. She lived in a society that was very divided by economic class, by gender, by race, by political party and affiliation. And I think our world is very divided that way too. And sometimes we think these divisions are impossible to overcome, but Moore was a person who bridged so many of those gaps and was an idealist in so many ways, and envisioned a world that could be without the evil that was seeping through her society. And I find that inspiring, and I hope that we can see through those kinds of eyes as well.
Well, I don't read many biographies, but I was just so taken with the book and enthralled in Hannah's story thank you for the book, and thanks for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate those words.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Seminary Dropout. Remember, you can find all the show notes for this show and all shows at shaneblackshear.com. Thanks to those that left ratings and reviews on iTunes this week. Remember, that keeps the show front and center. Also, remember, you can find me on Twitter at beardonabike. That's at beardonabike. Also, I'm on Facebook, facebook.com/ShaneBlackshear123. And remember that Seminary Dropout is listener supported. You can visit supportseminarydropout.com and press Become a Patron. Remember, this music you're listening to right now is by D.L. Rossi. You can find him online on iTunes and at dlrossi.com. All right, thanks again for joining me for another episode of Seminary Dropout. Stay tuned for next week's episode. Love you. Take care.